Hello and welcome to Varn Blog. Today I am with Justin Clark, public historian and digital initiatives director at the Indiana Historical Bureau, which works with the Indiana State Library. I think it's a division of the Indiana State Library. Holder of a BS in history/political science. One of those is a good degree, one of those is a bad one. From Indiana University of Kokomo, and Masters of the Arts in Public History from Indiana University, Indianapolis. And your research focused on the work of the freethinker Robert Ingersoll, a figure that we'll come back to. It's interesting because I think Ingersoll was kind of revived as a thinker with the new atheist to some degree. Him and H.L. Mencken. Mencken's legacy is much more, well,
a little mixed to understand
it. Contested. I mean, there is a white supremacist conference named after Mencken, although I don't think that's entirely fair to Mencken's legacy. It's not entirely unfair either, but
yeah,
Ingersoll is Ingersoll's interesting because Ingersoll to me represents Midwestern republicanism and what I would probably call its heroic bourgeois phase. And with that I mean, like, when the capitalist party that represented the clearly capitalist faction was actually probably somewhat progressive, and put that in appropriate scare quotes, in history, which similar to back when Karl Marx was writing for Republican newspapers in the United States, which I think people are often surprised to learn that so much of Marx's writing was journalism in the U.S. Go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. He wrote for the New York Tribune, Horace Greeley's publication, which was a title that was digitized by the National Digital Newspaper Program. It was part of one of the first rounds of ND&P digitization in the mid to late 2000s. So, a lot of people don't realize that you can actually just go and read Karl Marx's original editorials as they were printed in the New York Tribune online at the Library of Congress. You can also read a lot of the Daily Worker there too, which has also been digitized through Chronicling America. It's pretty amazing to think about that and of that period for sure.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like something actively suppressed about American history.
Yes. Yep.
But in some ways, Ingersoll to me represents kind of the high point of that phase. He's a figure that you can kind of link with someone like Ambrose Bierce, who, outside of his almost rabid hatred of socialism, Ambrose Bierce was in all other ways fairly progressive. But he really did hate socialists. But there's definitely this Republican tradition that is kind of muddled even by the early 20th century that Ingersoll kind of represents. I was going to talk to you about that. I don't know if I became familiar with you first through your work on freethinking or your work on socialism. You're also the co-host of a podcast called Red Reviews, which I think is you, and I believe you represent the secular humanist. Oh wow, my southern accent came back for a second. The secular humanist, like social democratic side, and then you have a Canadian anarchist co-host, I believe.
Yeah, that's the way I would just sort of describe it. So my colleague Corey Johnston and Corey and I have gone way back. I've been on his show back in the days when he did other shows, and we started doing Red Reviews about 3 years ago. And so I am so he's the anarchist and I am the broadly the Marxist. So the way I would mostly describe myself is like as a Marxist humanist or a sort of libertarian socialist, something closer to those lines. And so we have a really interesting rapport with one another, mainly just because I find that we try to do the show where we try to be as fair to the books that we discuss as possible. And we try not to kind of spout maybe a particular line, but try to open up people's ideas to the long, rich tradition of socialism and the history of socialism. And so it's a lot of fun. And so we do books. We've talked about Marx. We've talked about Lenin, Mao. We've done Trotsky. We've done libertarian socialists like Anton Panacek. That was one we just recently did about Marxism and Darwinism, which is a classic pamphlet that Panacek wrote in the early 1900s. He was a sort of council communist. So we try to give a rich tradition of the history of socialism to people on the show, and try our best to sort of give our 2 cents and kind of try to represent the writers we're discussing as best we can, and sort of let people make up their minds on their own where they kind of fall.
Yeah. I enjoy your podcast. Obviously, I discovered you through, I believe Instagram, actually, somewhat embarrassingly.
That's okay. I think I had listened to some of the stuff you had done with Doug Lane on Pop the Left. And I loved the stuff you guys were talking about back in the sort of Zero Books days. Now, obviously, Doug's doing his own thing, and you guys are still doing stuff with Sublation, which I think is great. And then, yeah, we followed Instagram, and we've sort of been acquaintances ever since. And it's really great to finally kind of have a chat.
Yeah. So this might go all over the place, but I do want to tie into one of the things I've noticed. You've talked about a lot of figures that were more important to me at an earlier age, and you've kind of wrestled with also some key, let's say, hang-ups with new atheism and that version of secular humanism. My foray into this world was, I remember watching a Peter Hitchens, Christopher Hitchens debate, which I believe I've actually discussed with Ben Burgess too.
Oh, okay, cool.
Way back, this would have been like while the Iraq War was still going on, and feeling like if you split the brothers and like combined half of each of them, you might have a decent human being.
It's probably fair.
So it was, although I will also say, somewhat surprisingly for me, my favorite of the 4 horsemen atheists who had any real clout, Dan Dennett, I never really understand how he got thrown into that categorization.
That's a good question. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that we have to like rewind our minds back to 2005 now, almost 20 years ago. But
yeah, no, you're absolutely right. So with Dennett, yeah, I think Dennett is interesting because he's the one who sort of gets the reputation as like the quiet one or the nice one. Although I think his style of intellectual is very similar to like Steven Pinker, where he comes off sort of soft and nice, but then when you actually read what he's saying, he's like kind of extremely arrogant and often comes off like in some respects, like he sort of overplays his hand, or he suggests things that are like ridiculous. Like, so a few years ago, I did a retrospective review on Daniel Dennett's book, Breaking the Spell. And sort of breaking down what the problem with the book was, because his whole big claim with that book was, well, I'm really going to bring sort of a natural history element to religion. I'm going to be, I'm going to study religion through sort of a rational scientific lens, and no one's really doing that, but I am. And it's like, what are you talking about? Like, if you look at the history of philosophy, if you go back to Hume, like, Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion, or Kant, or John Locke, right? The reasonableness of Christianity. They're always wrestling with those questions between religion and rationality, and religion and science. Like, that's a constant debate. But the other thing that he's really frustrating about him is his defense of memes, which, I mean, memes exist like on the internet as like fun little pictures, but like memes as like Richard Dawkins conceived of them were not accurate and were not true. And so I started reading in the scientific literature about how memetics as a field of study kind of fell apart in the mid 2000s. And in fact, the Journal of Memetics kind of closed in like 2007, 2008, saying basically this is a dead field. And that the sort of general wisdom with sort of how culture evolves is something called GCCE, which is gene culture coevolution, seems very rational and reasonable. It's like that genes evolve over time based on conditions, and cultural attitudes and cultural artifacts evolve based on those said material conditions, and they mingle together, as Marx maybe would say, is in a very dialectical way. And that's kind of the consensus. But the thing that I found most frustrating about Dennett in that book was he says later on in the book, he says, like, we have a department of health, for illnesses, like for outbreaks, but we also should have like a department of like basically like cultural health, where he says like we should be fighting against like bad ideas. And I'm like, this sounds very much like Committee of Public Information. This is like very like Palmer raids. This is the issue I have sometimes with science writers, is they have no concept of history. So they just kind of say something and then they don't really think through the consequences of that or look for some historical analogies. And so, yeah, I was like, well, this is like extremely authoritarian and problematic. And it's essentially against the whole idea of free thought. I don't think that Dennett is the worst of the four horsemen. I think by a mile, the worst is Sam Harris, who I think is a complete idiot. But and a racist.
I feel like I've been war with Sam Harris longer than I've been a leftist, actually. Since he wrote The End of Faith, I've been like, so you're a cultural chauvinist, which means you're some kind of racist. Your arguments are that belief and action perfectly mirror each other, except when they don't. You justify, and people like tell me he doesn't do this, and I'm like, go back and read the book. He justifies bombing people off of perceived belief. It's not ambiguous.
Yes. It's not ambiguous at all. And if you look, especially with Harris, I think the most frustrating thing for me with him is that he's just genuinely kind of an incurious person. Like I've not listened to his show in years, but I would imagine I can't even imagine what he might be saying right now about the Middle East, but like, he's written columns where he says like why I don't criticize Israel and like why we should be doing, racial profiling essentially. And the thing that he does is what I call the Harris two-step, which is that he creates this thought experiment, which is so absolutely insane that it would never happen in reality, which then makes his position, which is also nuts, look reasonable in comparison to it. And he does that with the example of like the nuclear first strike example in The End of Faith, where he's like, he talks about like, well, imagine that there's a bomb in Los Angeles and blah, 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 blah. And it's like, well, dude, maybe that's the case, but like in general, that's not something that happens all the time. And normally you wouldn't respond to that with like blowing up LA. Like, it seems like a very odd thing to me. And also, I always like to note this thing too, which is that how did Sam Harris become who he is? Because he seems like he kind of came out of nowhere, and he's a Nepo baby. So his mom was Susan Harris, who was the co-creator of the Golden Girls TV show.
Yeah.
And so, when he talks in his books about like, well, I went to Stanford and then I took a break and I did these meditation retreats, and like, how are you in your 20s and 30s being able to afford all of this? And it's like, oh, because you're just kind of you're kind of a leech off your mom's money. That makes sense. And so, yeah, no, I despise Sam Harris. And I think that his style of thinking, and specifically Michael Brooks's, the late great Michael Brooks, his responses to Sam Harris, his critiques of Sam Harris, are what pulled me out of the sort of new atheist lens, and then specifically what actually put me towards the left, because that was at that point where I recognized sort of that the secular movement, or for lack of a better word, the atheist movement's a dead end, and is extremely politically regressive, and I abandoned it. And so, yeah, I think that, I think in my opinion, my favorite is Hitchens. Like, I think my favorite is Hitch, but like, I acknowledge his extreme limitations, especially post 2001, when I think he just lost his goddamn mind. But that's,
Yeah, well, that's what I was going to talk to you. I was looking at your discussion of Hitchens. And my reading of Hitchens, I remember reading God Is Not Great. In fact, I've read, I think, every word the man's actually put in a book.
I'm pretty close to it as well, yeah.
Even his more ludicrous stuff about Jefferson and Orwell.
Yeah.
The thing I always found interesting about Hitch is people assumed Hitch was the most bellicose of the three of them, but he was actually the least bellicose of the three. One of the things that makes him interesting is he was the only one, even during his weird neoconservative period, who was a critic of Zionism.
Yeah.
That said, I mean, his debates with Chomsky is like Foucault's debates with Chomsky in a way that it's an interesting way to put you back in the problems of a different left. It's funny that Chomsky has apparently just been talking for long enough that we can bring him up in several major shifts in left-wing thinking.
Yeah. I mean, I think he's the fact that he's the dominant American left-wing intellectual and has been one for maybe going on 2-3 generations now is either like, wow, like the staying power of him, or, oh, wow, that's limiting. Like there's a limitation in that like, oh, that. But anyway, yeah, we can table that for a second. But yeah.
That is my, just to agree with you, that is my weird take on Chomsky. He's both the best and worst we have, and he's been the best and worst we've had for a long time. And people are like, yes. What do you mean? I'm like, well, he's better than 90% of the sectarians and stuff we get, or the Democrats, yet effectively he ends up being the same thing.
Yeah.
So what do you do with that? But it's interesting because I think you can kind of get like the Foucault Chomsky debate was a debate that when I first listened to it when I was in my 20s, and I was not a leftist yet, I thought that Foucault won. When I listened to it about 7 years ago again, I thought that Chomsky won. And when I listened to it last year, I was like, I don't think either of them won. I think this is a mystified conversation. And similarly with Hitchens versus Chomsky on the Iraq War, where I saw where Hitchens' frustrations were coming from. But his answer to it seemed insane, even to me at the time. I had grown up, I grew up in the heyday of like Hitchens being the leftist who hated the Clintons, and I also hated the Clintons as a teenager, and that was weird.
I was too. Wow, we're very similar in that.
Yeah, we're probably about the same age and range.
Yeah. I'm 33, so yeah.
Oh no, I'm a decade older than you. I hated the Clintons as a teenager when Clinton was in office.
I disliked the Clintons as a teenager, late teenager, early 20-something in college when I read No One Left to Lie To, because that's when I read that. I read most of Hitch when I was in college. Like I read God Is Not Great when I was 19, and I read a lot of that stuff at that point. I could go ad nauseum about how I feel like the Clintons were the death of the Democratic Party, and the Democratic Party has never really recovered from it since. But yeah, we can table that for another time. But
yeah, absolutely. I mean, in some ways, I mean, the Clintons are interesting in that they represent that the contradictions of the New Left led to the Atari Democrats. The Atari Democrats became the DNC, and what the DNC is a weird triangulating right-wing monstrosity of which both Biden and Obama limped us along through.
Yeah.
And even before I was a Marxist, I kind of saw that. I remember thinking in Obama's first administration, like, well, actually, Obama's first administration is what radicalized me probably more than anything else. I have been a radical in my teens. I've gone through this very conservative period. You've probably heard me talk about it. Won't go into detail again. But the Obamas picking not just the Clinton administration, but the right-wing elements of the Clinton administration.
Yes.
To kind of prove that they were not going to, to radically change much was very much a moment of we've been bamboozled. And I remember my friends celebrating the Obama victory in 2008, like, because for those of you who are in your 20s, yeah, the aughts were a particularly bad time to even be a liberal, much less a leftist.
Oh yeah, this is true. Especially if you go into a rural high school like I did. Yeah,
Yeah,
I get that.
me too. I lived in Central Georgia, so like, in fact, I left the country shortly after this, and stayed away for like almost a decade. But I remember thinking, oh, something has gone very wrong. And I also remember thinking this about what I saw to tie this into our first conversation, what I saw with New Atheism.
Yeah.
Because, well, I will say that the right-wing character of New Atheism is interesting in so much that the average New Atheist did not become a right-winger. They became depoliticized and became some kind of liberal, really. Like, if you...
That's right.
But the people who were the most committed to it, with the exception of, like... Oh, what's his name? These were the second-string New Atheist. He was the biologist who was a left-winger.
Jerry Coyne?
Yeah, Jerry Coyne.
Oh, not Jerry Coyne. No, I know
Coyne ended up being kind of a right-winger, actually.
Yes. I'm thinking of essentially like his left-wing doppelganger, and I think it's P.Z. Myers.
P.Z. Myers, exactly. No,
Yeah.
I thought Coyne was the better scientist, but ended up being the worst political thinker.
Yes, that's true.
And P.Z. Myers, who I thought made the most, when I was in that world, made the most ridiculous, like, we must not accommodate to religion no matter what, blah, 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 blah. And I was like, what do you think is actually at stake here? Like, and I remember even then, and like I said, this is around 2005, 2006, me thinking, man, for people who are supposedly materialists, you guys really think that like ideas around metaphysics, like, dominate the entirety of people's thinking.
Yeah, this is a very, very, very good point. This is something I've written about too in my review of Michael Brooks's excellent book Against the Web, where he kind of goes into some of this. That they don't view religion, say we would, as a sort of a phenomenon that grows out of material conditions, and thinking about, well, what would make somebody religious? It's also the problem that the new atheists, a lot of them, ironically enough, don't really understand that religion is more than the sum of its specific metaphysical beliefs. Religions are far more than that. So, like, they are often institutions of communal experience and community building and social justice. And they kind of often brush that to the side. My favorite was Michael Shermer in his book, The Moral Arc, made the argument that essentially Martin Luther King was a secular humanist and that his religion didn't really matter that much, which I thought was a bit odd. But Shermer is a problematic altogether. I mean, talk about somebody who by all accounts should have been canceled, but wasn't, for his own personal behavior. And I won't go into it, but anyway, yeah. So they have this weird, like, detached, extremely idealistic way of looking at religion, even though they expect everybody to be like these hardcore materialists. The other problem that they do is, and I call it the cult of reason, where they use the architecture, the sort of rhetorical architecture of rationality, to justify whatever they're saying. So their whole argument is, like, no matter how irrational or logical something coming from them seems, they sort of bathe themselves in the sort of the clothing of rationality, and somehow negates the fact that what they're saying is actually nuts. Sam Harris does this a lot. Part of it's because he speaks very calmly. So, like, if you could imagine, like, an insane right winger at CPAC screaming what Sam Harris's words, we would think that person was an insane person. But because Sam Harris is like this sort of boring, speaks in a very boring, anodyne way, he kind of gets away with it. And so I think that that's a real problem too, is that just because you say you're being reasonable doesn't mean you're actually being reasonable.
Yeah, I remember, one time I was going to sit down with a former friend of mine, who I used to do a show with called Mortal Science, and kind of trace what happened to the new atheists, and particularly the kind of second and third generations. And I always would point out, why do we call them new atheists? Well, they were trying to distinguish themselves from two other groups. They were trying to distinguish themselves from the 70s secular humanist movement, which they had they didn't have contempt for, but they thought was not radical enough or something.
Yeah, they thought it was squishy.
Right. And then they were also, and I think people miss this, trying to distinguish themselves from the old atheists, by which they meant Marxist.
Yes.
Yes. You know, it's just like,
yes.
Like there was an implicit anti-communism in a lot of what they did. And the only person who was explicit about it, weirdly, was Hitchens, when Hitchens was also the softest towards communism. Like it was, but he was more like, I remember when he called his old Trotskyism a secular religion. And I also remember the debates that Sam Harris had with Scott Atran way back in the day. And that's what kind of started getting me out of it. I was, you know, I'd come out of, I had actually kind of gone through the reverse. I was a secular conservative anti-war person in the early aughts, because my contact with the left and the ultra globalization movement was a left that I kind of figured was dead set on being minoritarian no matter what. Like they took pride in it. Countercultural for good and for ill, and easily manipulated because they had no real, like, they basically operated off of piecemeal moral concerns. And I had not developed an understanding that this was kind of, you know, the way I would explain this today with the Gen X and very, very early elder millennial left, like, you know, those of us who came up in the 90s and the early aughts, is that we were dealing with the seeming delegitimization of Marxism from the fall of the Soviet Union, which we have grown up through, and had no real narrative for how to handle that, and no real narrative of what an alternative would be. But we'd also seen left liberalism, as shown to us in New Dealism and the New Left, be utterly decimated by its own victories. Actually, you know, it's just obvious. Like, yeah. If it wasn't just Clinton, it was Blairism. It was the stuff going on in Latin America in the 90s, with the exception of Hugo Chavez. Like it was just a period of whitewash, and we kind of had a mixture of an inchoate anarchism, some of which I miss, but also a kind of moral critique of not even capitalism per se. It wasn't even coherent enough to say we were morally critiquing neoliberalism. It was like morally critiquing corporate society, ab buster style. And I rejected that. I just was like, that's anti-systematic. It's not, it's weirdly moralistic, but I can't figure out what actual moral basis it comes from. And I ended up on the anti-war right. The anti-war right, however, was a gaggle of things that would later be manifested in Trumpism, where you had like cultural and racial nationalists hiding out and at that time speaking in code. And I think people like sometimes were like, well, how did you not know? And I'm like, dude, they spoke in code. Like, even if you were in the movement before, weirdly, even in the very conservative time period of the 2000s, the right felt safer speaking in code than it does now, where it'll just say it outright directly.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree with that 1,000%. And my trajectory is very similar to yours. So like my political radicalization also happened in the first Obama years. I worked on Obama's campaign in 2008. It was actually my high school senior project, which was a lot of fun, because then you could like put up your big red, white, and blue like trifold like tricorder border thing in the gym for all this senior project day, and you have this big poster of Obama and you're pissing all these rednecks off, which is kind of cool. But at least that's how I felt at the time. And but I found his first moves to be extremely disappointing to me. And at the time, there really was no left that I could really identify with. This is like 2009, 10, 11. And so the only real alternative was the libertarian right. And that was when, you know, like a lot of young people, that's when I discovered Ayn Rand, and I read Ayn Rand and became kind of an objectivist and became involved in the libertarian movement, and really left it for a variety of reasons. But the main ones was sort of figuring out what you did, which is, oh my God, all these people are speaking in code and they're not really saying what they actually believe.
Right.
And then also just kind of recognizing two things. One, a lot of them are sort of neo-Confederates, so they very much believe in sort of the lost cause bullshit about the Civil War. And that, Lincoln was like the dictator par excellence, and the South was like the noble cause. It was all about states' rights and the right to rebel and all this, instead of like, well, why were they doing that? Why were they deciding to secede from the Union? As if no one knew the cornerstone speech that Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy, gave in 1861, where he basically clearly flat out says in that speech, we are separating from the Union because we want to maintain slavery. Like, it's very clear. It's also in the Confederate Constitution. So they just kind of lie. And then also recognizing the corporate network that funds all of this stuff, which the left doesn't really have a corollary to. Really, why would it? And so unless you count Jeffrey Katzenberg giving the Young Turks $20 million or something like that, which I don't, but but you recognize, well, it's all funded by the Kochs, and all these are kind of connected, and you end up like Charlie and It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, where it's like you've put the connections together, and you're like, wait, this is all connected by dark money, and it's fucked up, and so you're like, I'm done with this, like I'm done.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I had a very similar. I had a very, very similar trajectory.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, one thing I'll say about the paleo-conservative world in the aughts is that it overlapped. Like, we were on the same side in opposing Bush as the libertarians. But I remember even then going, how are these dudes defending Gary North, who's like going and standing for Rush Dooney and also talking about a minimal state? Like, that doesn't make any sense. They're dominionist. Like,
yeah.
Or you just and Thomas Woods' weird neo-Confederate stuff. I'm naming names here because I can.
Yeah, Thomas Woods. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, he's a weird mix of like libertarianism, neo-Confederatism, and Catholicism. Like, you put all of those together. That's because I've read 2 or 3 of his books. So
he's
exactly
a trad calf. It's a weird trad calf. Also,
he makes Rod Dreher look slightly normal compared to him.
Yeah, I mean, he also wrote a book that was like the anti-Max Weber, where he was like, no, Catholicism is what gave us capitalism. And I'm like, what? Like, it was like, okay, in the absolute loosest, weirdest sense, kind of maybe.
Yeah.
But like, no. And, but then I also started meeting people like Hans. Well, I didn't meet Hans Hermann Hoppe. I did have the misfortune of meeting Richard Spencer in this world.
Oh.
But, people forget he was the arts and culture editor for American Conservative during the first part of the Bush administration.
I did not know that. That's interesting. I did not know that.
And then he joined something called the Something Policy Institute out of Augusta, Georgia, which is where I was born, actually.
What was that, EPI, the economic
EPI,
policy?
economic, which is not at all. That's a right-wing nationalist like group that took a very normie name, so you wouldn't know what it was.
Oh yeah. These organizations are really, really good at that. Like Students for Liberty, which was an organization that I was involved in college, that was an outgrowth of the youth section of the Ron Paul campaign. Mm-hmm. And even when I was a libertarian, I didn't like Ron Paul. And part of it was I didn't love how religious he was. At that time, I was a Randian atheist, and I thought, like, I didn't like that. And I didn't like his views on abortion. Part of the appeal of Ayn Rand to me was that she was an atheist and that she was pro-choice. And those were the two things, because those are like kind of big things for me at that time. But yeah, no, I think you're right. And you think about, the people that I kind of met when I was involved in it were people like, I met John Stossel.
Yeah, I know who
who in person wears an absolute mountain of makeup. Like he is caked up to be on television. Never seen someone have so much makeup on TV. I met Tom Palmer, who was a part of like Cato. I met David Bose. I met Gary Johnson. I met some of those people. They're more marginal.
The more what's interesting about the names that you're listing, I would consider them like, some of them are clowns. Mm-hmm. But I don't consider them necessarily evil.
Yeah, I agree.
Whereas some of the people I dealt with in the paleo conservative world, when we were united against Bush, you didn't see it. But because also, you know, you're doing a double move because you're rejecting neoconservatism, but you're also rejecting the left as it existed. And then all of a sudden you wake up and you're like, oh, Joe Sobrin's over here. I wonder why he got kicked out of Writing for the National Review. It must have been war stuff. Oh no, it wasn't that. It was because he perpetuated a Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy. You know, which Buckley was okay with you doing as long as you never actually did it. You know what I mean? Like, Buckley was very cool with that kind of stuff as long as you were smart enough to keep your mouth shut about what you were implying.
Yes.
But Sobrin said it out loud and directly. Similarly, Gary John, I remember Ron Paul and Lou Rockwell were in this orbit, as was later fun people like who's that cult guy who did Free Thought Radio? Who became a nationalist? He became a white nationalist.
Is that Stefan Molyneux?
Yeah, Stefan Molyneux.
Yes.
Like but I mean, he was. I will say, even the right wingers considered him culty, even in the Bush administration. But there was stuff about it I remember being profoundly torn about Ron Paul, because I thought it was interesting that Ron Paul indicated to me that there is an anti-imperialism latent even in the conservative side of life. And yet also that he was horribly reactionary, hanging out with people like Lou Rockwell and Hans Hermann Hoppe. And Hans Hermann Hoppe was one of those people who was like, yeah, feudalism is good because it's really capitalism, which A, is wrong, but B, also like, what? Like, the good stuff about capitalism is that it recapitulates feudalism through private ownership. Like, that's a good thing. Like,
yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And yeah, I think you're right about Paul. I mean, that was what attracted me to some of his his ideas, was mainly just the fact that it was like, oh, here's this like old crotchety dude from Texas who kind of gets it about the US empire, and like, oh, that's kind of interesting. But, you know, growing up, I mean, to be frank, I mean, like the people who were more influential on me about ideas of American empire were people like Gore Vidal, who I've written about and I've talked about a lot, and we did an episode of Red Reviews on Gore Vidal, and outside of like, left politics or whatever, like Gore Vidal is probably my favorite author, and reading his like pamphlets in the early 2000s, like as a middle schooler, high schooler, were important to me in terms of learning about the big difference between the Republic, like his conception of the Republic, which is in some respect kind of like idealistic, right? Mm-hmm. But the empire, and that the Republic always cedes ground to the empire. And just hearing somebody talk about it in that way was like compelling to me, because I could get that. So yeah, but yeah, I think for a lot of us, who are sort of disappointed in the Obama era and sort of disappointed in left liberalism in general, we were all kind of in the wilderness for a while, and maybe it's a wilderness we've never really left because of the wreckage of the last 15 years.
Yeah, I hate to be on the millennial left failed kick, but oh
no, I agree with Chris Catrone on this. I think he's right. So
yeah, well, I've Chris. I refer to Chris as a frenemy of the show because he's sort of my problematic mentor. I mean, you probably know that. I left the Platypus Affiliated Society in 2013, but like, I was educated by them. The millennial left thing is interesting, but I think about the context of us all being in the wilderness and what it seemed to move from my perspective, living through it, and you lived through it too, so you can kind of give me we're only separated. Actually, interesting, if Doug Lane was here, you'd have like 10 years.
Yeah, that would be interesting.
It would be really interesting talk. But when you think about like what the left was prior to 2007, and then what the financial crisis coalesced for me. I mean, for me, the financial crisis led me to considering two things. One, that the new atheist movement had no serious thing to say about a lot of the primary things in life. And the more I heard them talk about like ethics and whatnot, I was like, your ethics are absurd. You're arguing that they're objective off of I don't know what. You don't want to deal with meta ethics. You don't want to deal with anthropology. I remember having the same problem as you with like this mimetic theory that you're operating off of is literally a fucking analogy. Like,
Yeah.
um,
And when you recognize like in something I write about in the Dennett essay that I wrote is that our modern conception of memetics actually comes from a book that Douglas Hofstadter edited called The Mind's Eye. It came out in like the early 80s. Daniel Dennett was like an editor on that book too. And the idea of memetics, of course, the meme comes from Richard Dawkins. You're right. It is an analogy. When Richard Dawkins writes about it in The Selfish Gene, he's not talking about it as if it's like, as if memes are a real thing. He's using them as an analogy to describe what he thinks genes do. Mm-hmm. But what happens is Dennett kind of gloms onto this idea and kind of goes crazy. And so what they do is the chapter that Richard Dawkins is attributed to writing in that book, The Mind's Eye, is a chapter that's a Frankenstein's monster of his writing, where they pull from here and they pull from there, and they kind of edit it all together to say something that he didn't actually originally say. And so right out the gate with the idea of memetics itself and how it caught on in sort of the scientific literature started with a deception. Like right out the gate, it started with intellectual dishonesty, at least in my opinion. And so when you know that and you go like, so they basically moved Richard Dawkins's words around to say what they wanted them to say rather than what he was actually saying. And this is the most charitable you're ever going to hear me be about Richard Dawkins, by the way. But yeah, I think that is really, really, really telling about the limits of that worldview and the limits of the new atheism for sure.
Well, one of the things I remember about the second tier new atheists, and particularly the British contingent, actually, probably more than the American, is they were really at war with something I am still kind of at war with, although I think like blaming postmodernism, quote unquote, is lazy. But to go full Colette on things, I don't even know what postmodernism is, and I've studied it.
It's a bit like quantum physics. If you think you know it, maybe you probably don't.
Right. And it's also fallen out of fashion to even talk about in academia now.
Yeah.
In fact, I was just at an intellectual history conference where like the one person who was talking about postmodernism was like the old crotchety person, and we were just all like, what? Which is just which is wild to me, given my own training was in the arts, where like, and I got trained both in the humanities. Well, I got trained on the humanities, but I got trained both in literature and in kind of analytic philosophy, and in anthropology. And I remember getting in debates with like Derridians and Heideggerians and stuff a lot, in the aughts. But one of the things I noticed that people use this attack on Heidegger to do was to throw sociology, anthropology of religion out the door. And in fact, one of the things that I'm not going to be charitable about Dawkins about is in his book, The God Delusion, he literally starts trying to make every other field evolutionary biology.
Yes.
Like including like cosmology and like alternate and like theoretical physics, and it just it like clicked my button that something was going off here, that like, even at the time I remember critiquing, like I was like, what's with that chapter in this book? Like, why are people not pointing out that chapter's nuts? Like it, like that it's wild speculation by a responsible scientist, but one that, by the time that we're encountering him, in the aughts and in the late 90s, he hadn't really done science in a long time. Actually, he'd been mostly a professor of scientific communication.
Yes.
And he had embroiled himself in this battle versus the postmodernists who he believed were somehow the same as like pseudo-historians. And I admit that the worst of that was anti-intellectual. I mean,
yeah.
And it made stuff like Michael Shermer's bullshit
Yes.
seem very appealing. One of the things I think it's easier to fight this today as like the later generation of Michael Schumer style bullshit, like the Peter Boghossian, James Lindsay style,
Oh yeah.
like pseudo repeat of the Sokol hoax from like I guess 7 years ago now. Like which was published in a pay to play journal and like anyway.
Yeah.
But which is a very different thing than like sneaking a bad article into social text.
Yeah.
What I found interesting about that is that Sokol, in the context of France, thought he was defending like old socialist materialism, actually, against like these post-Marxists who had just used metaphors to go to absurd lengths and had abandoned any like rigorous conception of materialism for whatever. And what James Lindsay and Peter Boghossian thought they were doing was fighting the Marxists, who had corrupted applied social science, a field, I'm just gonna, not to talk shit, but a field that's not really known for having strong methodologies in the first place.
Yeah, it's like evolutionary psychology. It's the same. It has the same problems.
Yes. That was another fun thing about the new atheism is they just took evolutionary psychology on face value. And I remember to go back to P.Z. Myers a bit, and it's important that while we separate him from Jerry Coyne, that
Yeah.
P.C. Myers actually started like waking up from his whole like pro new atheist alone, like we don't make accommodations into debates about evolutionary psychology, because he's like, wait, if you understand comparative biology, you can't make these generalizations that they're making. And also, some of them are just wrong. Like they're just ignoring. Like I remember reading a Evo Psych paper that got published in a journal that was arguing about how blue and pink are like naturally evolved color associations. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And anyone who'd looked at any of the basic fucking literature on gender history would know that like those associations switched in the late 19th, early 20th century, and beforehand they were reversed. So trying to like tie that into this to savanna evolution hunter gatherers is like ridiculous. And then I started reading, because I just got out of an anthropology program and a forensic anthropology program, but I started reading like Marshall Solomons and people like that, and realizing like, oh no, these evolutionary psychologists, like they're just ignoring they're ignoring the anthropological data. It's not just that like there's a debate over what it means. Like they're just bracketing huge amounts of even forensic anthropology out. And this is largely speculative based off of assumed modules. And honestly, this is a problem that I have with Chomsky, because Chomsky does do this too. He assumes that like, modules are based on biological things, the substrata in the brain and their material and genetic and this, and there's a human nature. And while I admit that like the Daniel Everett critique of that ended up being a little bit bullshitty, I have realized that it's impossible to prove Chomsky's assert. It's just impossible to prove if those are like convergent things that would just happen because of outside things, or if they're genes, if you're looking at something that you can't find explicit gene triggers for.
It's pretty tricky.
Yeah. So, I guess this is to say that I get why someone coming out of the New Left would have been intellectually, I mean, the new left, new atheism, would be intellectually confused, because it seemed like a response to what is interesting to me about it is that it was a sincere response to a particular political fusionism that has now sort of gone away, but we have forgotten about it. Like the relationship between evangelical Christianity, although greatly overstated about how far that actually went in Bush made policy. This is one thing that I always say. Like, I don't think dominionism had much to do with Bush policy at all.
No, it actually it held far more influence under Trump than it did under Bush.
Right. I mean, interestingly,
Yes.
and what is interesting about that is that Trump is actually a more secular president than Bush in a lot of ways, and yet the religious right had more influence on his administration.
Because it's purely transactional. Like
Right.
the big difference is that like Bush would talk a good game about certain things, whereas Trump would actually give them what they wanted. And I think that I'm with you on yes, people often overstated the case about the evangelicals in power, but I do think Christian nationalism is a real problem. And I do think it's something, especially with this whole Project 2025 stuff with Trump, people need to be wary of, because, the current Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, is a Christian nationalist. And he was in a closed door room basically comparing himself to Moses. So we might be through the looking glass a little bit with these people. But there is something interesting at the heart of the new atheism that I'm always kind of intrigued by, is that there were antecedents to it. And one that I think is very important is that sort of there was the path that was taken and the path that was not taken. And I sort of use two intellectuals in the 20th century to kind of explain that in the secular movement. One is Corliss Lamont, who is a name that most people don't often know, but Corliss Lamont was kind of one of the founders and fathers of secular humanism in America. He was also a socialist. He was also a Marxist, and was one of the early founders and supporters of the ACLU. So a man who was firmly on the left and often got pilloried for it, got sort of swept up in the chaos of the McCarthy years. But you have Corliss Lamont, who is sort of this secular humanist of the left. And that's just the path not taken. The secular humanist movement never really went to the left. It always sort of stayed kind of normie centrist liberal. And part of that is because of the other person that I'm going to mention, and that is Sidney Hook. So Sidney Hook, who started as the great trader, yes, started as a Marxist and became a neoconservative. His story is very similar to Hitch, although I would say Hook did it far more successfully and perhaps more grandly. I mean, I think he got like the Presidential Medal of Freedom or something like that.
Yeah, the Presidential Medal of Freedom. He also was like the left-wing like cover for the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which one of the reasons why I'm always like, hey, be careful when you call Christopher Lasch a conservative, because he pointed out how many people were under the Congress for Cultural Freedom's clutches, and pointed out that they were probably CIA before it was declassified. He just happened to be right.
Yes. Well, and I'm with you on this too, because I've written about Lasch, and he's one of my favorite authors and thinkers, and he is a man of the left. But he is a man who is both on the left and sort of at war with it at the same time, in the sense that he is very much critiquing the sort of cultural, what he calls, I think, what does he call it? He calls it like the medicinal turn of politics, where instead of politics being about sort of real tangible struggles for improving people's lives, it turns into this sort of like medicalization, where it's like we're all going to therapy, and therapy sort of replaces politics. That's a lot in his book, The Minimal Self, which I really, really like. But yeah, no, it's interesting to me. So like you see all of it there. And to me, the new atheism is sort of like very much a part of that whole end of history, non-ideology, radical, the extreme center, as Tariq Ali called it. And so it was this sort of abandoning of ideology. Like, look at us, like we don't believe in religion, but we also don't believe in political religions like communism or Marxism. And so it was a way of sort of kind of washing their hands of that, because they knew that if they were more strident on the left politically in a time in the 90s, that it would be, you would often be treated as sort of persona non grata, or just not treated like as someone of importance at all. But in my opinion, the road that the broader secular movement took was Hook's. It took the Hook route instead of taking the Lamont route. And I think we've sort of paid the consequences ever since.
Yeah, that's actually, I've never even thought about putting Lamont and Hook as kind of two options of where you could have gone, but Hook really is, in many ways, he's the most successful anti-communist, in that he took American pragmatism and Deweyan pragmatism, and people wonder why I hate John Dewey so much. But there's 1,000 reasons. But anyway, and used it to create an alternative, and particularly when the New Left kind of washed up on the shores of history for for a variety of reasons that are complicated to go. Like, to be honest, one of the things I like about Lasch as a corrective, because for all of my dallying with Chris Catrone, one of the things that I used to argue with him about was like, well, it couldn't have started with the New Left. Like, the problem had to be older than that. And Catrone would say yes, but then would not tell me what the problem older than that was. And like, so I started trying to figure that out. And I had read Lasch actually as a right winger, because when I was coming up in the early aughts, the only people leading Lasch were right wingers. Weirdly, I mean, but very, and it was not like, it wasn't right wingers of the George Bush persuasion. They didn't give a shit. It was like Roger Kimball from New Criterion and the people at First Things, like, and it was based off of his last 3 books, and particularly the Critique of Progress book, a book that I am lukewarm with to this day. I mean, I love Lasch, but I do have problems with him, even as kind of a Lasch scholar. But what Lasch gave me was a way to look at the American left, to break it off from the European left, because what you often have is we talk about Europe until, say, the 1930s. Then we talk about the United States. Then we talk about Europe again, because because the 70s is embarrassing for the American left. And then we talk about the United States. And what Lasch made me look at was like, no, there's a history of the left that's actually rooted in socialism that goes back a long time. I mean, his histories go back to like the 1870s. And that they're problematic. Like, it's like some of these problematics are actually old, specific to the United States, and you need to look at that. And I would say one of his kind of unstated contentions is that the left doesn't know its own history, and thus is doomed to constantly make similar mistakes, but even more so. So like, you like, the way Lasch seems to view it is like, oh, we're back in the cycle again, but this time we're going to go further into this cycle of culturalism, or of privileging countercultures or whatever. And Lasch doesn't hate the counterculture. That's a misreading of Lasch. But he is skeptical of it, because if it never remerges with the main culture, it is not definitionally a mass movement. And how can you possibly have a left that's meaningful, that's supposed to liberate everybody, if in fact, most bodies are not in it? And his analysis is more complicated than that. But he was definitely on the Sidney Hook as traitor train, which it is kind of an interesting thing to think about today, because I do, even to me, when in the aughts, if you were to tell me what was the most interesting, prestigious, rational skeptic or new atheist journal, I would have said Skeptic Magazine by Michael Shermer. One of the only benefits, I think, to the aught tens in this crazy Coolette James Lindsay bullshit, James Lindsay, who is channeling the conservative Eric Vogelin and the other and the arch reactionary von Kuhnlin, which no one knows that's where people like Lindsay's getting his ideas from, is these mid-century reactionaries. But when Lindsay's talking about like Marxists all being secret Gnostics, that's where that comes from, and he's not citing his sources.
It's like Jordan Peterson with Stephen Hicks. It's the same thing. So
right.
when Peterson's talking about postmodernism and his ideas about postmodernism, they are cut whole cloth from Stephen Hicks, who's an objectivist. And the objectivist, sort of history philosophies that Kant was like the worst thing that ever happened ever. And then Hegel was even worse. And then Marx was even worse. Like, and it all goes back to how Kant was awful. And Peterson says the same stuff. So I remember when Peterson became popular and I started hearing that, I went, wait a minute, I know where this is coming from. It's very weird when they don't, it's like I know where you're getting this, but the people you're telling this to don't know that.
Yeah.
And that's the weird part.
And also, frankly, the left doesn't know it, so they don't know how to counter it.
Yes. That's right.
I mean, one of the things, one of the reasons why I was going to get back to Gore Vidal, but one of the things I like about a lot of your shorts is you have clearly read a lot of right wing literature. Now that I know that you're a libertarian, it makes sense. I find that often trying to get libertarian, trying to get like left wingers to read right wing literature, and you can sometimes get them to weird, and I say this as a person who might be contributed to it by doing a long series on Dubin, but you can sometimes get them to read the weird European reactionaries like Avola or whatever, but trying to get them to read like a libertarian is like pulling teeth.
Yeah.
Because I'm like, no, like you need to understand, yeah, libertarianism's stupid. I get it. Like, but it's more persuasive once you understand its first premises than you think, unless you undermine its first premises. Another thing that got me off of that, I mean, I got into this before I even was a leftist, but it moved me there. Around 2005, I was like dealing with John Locke, and I had this admiration for John Locke, kind of coming out of the Hitchens, radical centrist, Enlightenment, blah, 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 Steven Pinker. Although I've always hated Pinker. I'll get back to that later. I was like, I remember reading The Better Angels of Our History and going like, there's some of the most shoddy scholarship, can't speak today, that I've ever read. Like, he's using like library popular books to make statistical arguments about deaths and stuff. It was just bizarre.
It's wild what Steven Pinker can get away with. If you just look at his citations, a lot of times when he's citing something that he's sort of presenting as a scientific fact, it turns out he got that from like a New York Times columnist, and it's like, who may or may not have pulled that idea out of their ass. Like, it's the big issue I have in the Pinker book briefly is he makes this argument that violence was worse in prehistorical times based on like percentages of those who were killed rather than like total deaths. And I'm like, but that's kind of a squishy way of saying it. Yeah, maybe they killed 20% of those people, but that's 20% of what, 5,000? Whereas, like, 27 million Soviet people died in World War II. That's infinitely worse than anything that may have happened thousands of years ago, even if it's just a percentage. I always thought that was a very slippery argument that he makes. And I'm just like, no. And Pinker's the worst at it because, like, he comes off as this, like, very nice Canadian guy. But when you actually read him, he's an asshole. He comes off as, like, a pretentious, arrogant ass. And there are people who've done amazing work just debunking him. I mean, I think Jason Hickel, the guy who's the degrowth guy, he wrote like a whole paper on just like basically debunking one page of one of Steven Pinker's books. It's kind of incredible. I can't remember which book it is. It might be Enlightenment Now, but yeah, it's just kind of laying out that like, and Pinker also is like a terrible intellectual historian. Like, I don't know if you ever read Enlightenment Now, which is one of his later books.
Oh, it's like, a terrible fucking book.
Terrible book.
Even a centrist, well, I don't know that he's a centrist liberal, but let's say even a person as not Marxist as, say, Jonathan Israel.
Yeah.
I wanted to take the Jonathan Israel books and bludgeon Steven Pinker to death with them.
Yes.
Like, it was just, I just remember reading Enlightenment Now and being like, how can you read any historiography of the Enlightenment and just like ignore this shit? Like ignore the debates, the contradictions, like the long tradition. I mean, one thing I wanted to kind of talk about, one of the things I liked about your show and like your approach to intellectual history, and it may be kind of an intellectual accident, but because you come out of the free thought movement and also went through libertarianism, which now I know and makes a little bit more sense. I now see why you seem to know like American history a lot better than a lot of leftists do, because that is kind of a problem that a lot of leftists do not know pre-1930s American history, like at all. No. But
yeah, they don't. And I think the big problem with that is, and I'm trying to figure out how to way to articulate this, because like for me, the problem I have with a lot of like traditional like American historiography that most popular audiences get
Mhm.
or popular conceptions of American historiography as interpreted through the left. A lot of it is that sort of like America with like the 3 Ks, and that like the United States is like the worst country that has ever existed ever, and it's committed the most atrocities and that and the other. Now, I'm not going to deny that the United States has an extremely dark history in terms of the fact that this country was founded upon the genocide of one people and this enslavement of another. I'm not going to deny that. But, and this is where I think it's really critical, is that it's dialectical in the sense that you have all of those awful things, but you also have the idea of governments instituted upon men, and that they're instituted for the sake of the governed, and the idea of freedom of speech, and the idea of freedom of conscience, the Bill of Rights. You know, these Enlightenment ideals that have been solidified in popular government. That's pretty radical too, and like and a tradition that we should celebrate, even if we know that the people who wrote it were deeply problematic in and of themselves. And and so for me, it's always about looking at the contradictions inherent in American history and acknowledging that they're dark, but not throwing out all of the baby with the bathwater. I think there's a lot of good in American history that you can see too, whether it's Thomas Paine, and fighting, sort of the godfather of Social Security, or you have obviously Eugene Victor Debs, who Ingersoll was a very close friend to, and Ingersoll was a sort of huge influence on Debs rhetorically. Debs wrote about it a lot. And you think about the populist movement, the real populist movement of the 1890s that was firmly on the left. Was, if you understand the history, you can see there's a lot of good there.
Yep.
And for people who want to learn more about it, I mean, there are 2 books I always tell people to check out. One is The S Word by John Nichols, which is a terrific popular history on the history of socialism in America. And the other book is Marxism in the United States by Paul Bull. Both of those books are great because they show where a lot of the different currents of socialist thought come out in America. Some of it comes from sort of the spiritualist tradition and the religious traditions of socialism that exist in America, right? We go back to Robert Owen. The Owen utopian community was in New Harmony, Indiana. It's in my neck of the woods. It's about 2 hours south of where I live. So there's that rich tradition there. You have the sort of the emergence of the spiritualist movement, the New Thought movement of the late 19th century. You have the Bellamy Club. So, Edward Bellamy, Looking Backward, the classic novel about utopian socialism in America. And then obviously Upton Sinclair and others. It's like there's a very rich tradition to be proud of here, that we shouldn't say everything about America is awful, because it isn't. There's a lot of good about America, and acknowledging what's bad actually makes the good stuff about America, the things that we can be proud of, look even better in comparison. So that's kind of the way I try to approach it, is to just not be so sort of like quickly moralistic, and try to get at the real material reasons why the United States became what it became. And that's what I try to do in my work.
Yeah, I was actually thinking about this. Maybe this is a good way to kind of wrap this up, but also like build towards your work. And by wrap this up, this still might be a fairly long conversation, so a warning. I wanted to talk about how this is manifested in the contradictions and interesting contradictions of Gore Vidal. One of the things you might not know about me, but Gore Vidal was also a key influence on me when I was coming out of high school. And what's interesting about him is the same impulses in him that moved me to the left as a teenager and then back to the left in my late 20s, is also what led me to the right. Like his talk about the Republic, and Republican virtues, and then he doesn't use this language. I think this language is clarified by people like Michael Sandel, the kind of left communitarian, who talks about like the problems with the administrative state. Although again, he also acknowledges that's been recuperated by right wingers now.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
But what the Republic was, and what like the progressive period of like what I call the progressive period of bourgeois culture, before progressivism. I mean, interestingly, I think progressivism has an actual history that's very mixed, at best.
Yes.
And that's me being generous.
Agreed.
But there is a kind of high bourgeois culture that is like wrestling with its racialism, realizing it needs to, that there, the contradictions of that are becoming clear to people. It does lead to weird things. My observation that apparently outside of John Brown, nobody could be good on both the Native Americans and on uh, enfranchising black people. You could either be good on one or the other. I still don't have a good theory as to why it is. It's just a historical observation. One of the weirder things about the Confederacy is like about 40% of them were wildly imperialistic, but then there was another like actually larger number of them who were actually like conciliatory towards the Native Americans, which was weird given the rest of the stuff. And I say that also people should be aware agrarians and neo-Confederates will hide behind that. That's something you should know. And even people who seem rational, I think you mentioned Gregory Johnson, not Gregory Johnson. Gregory Johnson's a white nationalist. The other Johnson,
Gary Johnson, yeah.
Gary Johnson, yeah. Gregory Johnson is one of the lead publishers at Countercurrents, who was a, I don't know if that still exists, but it was a white nationalist alt-right publication, kind of to the right of VDARE. And if you know how bad that is, you know what we're talking about. If you don't, then maybe you're a better person than me. VDARE was a kind of paleo-conservative racial outlet ran by a former editor of Forbes, named for Virginia Dare, and which is supposedly the first white child born on the continent, if you want to know the reference. Anyway, just so I'm not slandering Gary Johnson, because he's not Gregory Johnson. Greg Johnson is a much worse character.
No. Gary Johnson strikes me as being, I don't think he's like a terrible person. I just think he's a bit of a political neophyte. Like, I just don't think he's like that serious as a political entity. He's somebody that like you would rather him be the kind of the leader of the libertarian movement than say people in like the Mises Caucus now who are legitimately fascists. So yeah, I mean, I would much rather the Libertarian Party be what it was like 10, 15 years ago under people like Gary Johnson than it is now. It's really gotten far, far worse. But to talk about Vidal, you're right. I mean, I think to understand Vidal is to understand one really crucial element about him, which is that his grandfather was an enormous influence on him.
Mm-hmm.
So Thomas Pryor Gore, Senator T.P. Gore, senator from Oklahoma, who starts his political career as sort of a populist, more on the left, ends his career certainly more on the reactionary, isolationist right. So Vidal always has these kind of currents going in him where his anti-imperialism is also informed by an isolationism. Which for good or ill, sometimes I make the joke that, the United States has done a century of not isolationism. Maybe we should give it a try. But there's that element to it. So, when Vidal was when he was going to, primary school or whatever, when he was in because he didn't go to college. This is another interesting thing about, he went into the army and then became a published author. So he was very much an autodidact and most of what he learned, but he was in the political debates. So, he was alongside the sort of the America Firsters and this and that and the other. So a lot of Gore Vidal's political opinions, by the time you get to him as a sort of mature thinker, he's on the left, but he sort of got to those positions in this sort of circuitous way where he kind of goes through the right to get to those positions that are largely on the left. And that's something I kind of identify with because I did sort of the same thing. But yeah, I do think there's an idealization of the Republic. But at the same time, there's also a very grim reality of how the empire kind of grew. And, for him, the United States up until about World War II was like not that much of an empire. And then it sort of becomes one, more so after World War II, although he writes in his novel Empire more about like the Spanish-American War, and a lot of it can be tied back there. But the national security state, the era of anti-communism, the Truman years, the Red Scare, the Lavender Scare, going into McCarthyism, these all were the formative years in which he became a writer. And I think they informed him deeply. So I think that's what makes Vidal interesting, is that he doesn't always fit neatly in a box. You know, he's not always explicitly on the right. He's not always explicitly on the left. He's always sort of himself. And that kind of is frustrating at times because you wish it'd be a little bit more consistent, but it's also refreshing at times because you're just like, oh, he's thinking through this in real time because he actually cares. And the one thing that I think I've realized over the years is, as somebody who's read most of Gore Vidal's books now and has sort of been doing a retrospective of his work over the last couple of years, is that Hitchens is a lesser version of Gore Vidal. That Hitch is not as that Hitch wants to be Gore Vidal so bad and writes like him and sort of has the same impulses as him, but is never quite as good. I mean, I think I think that, Gore Vidal he wrote a lot about religion, like his classic essay, his classic book, like Messiah, which is, I think, one of his best novels, which is about a cult, or books like Life from Golgotha, which is like his tragic comedy about Jesus. It's very good too. But he wrote an essay in the 80s called Monotheism and Its Discontents, which I think is like a harbinger of things to come. Like if you read it, it reads very much like something the Hitchens would have written or Dawkins would have written 10, 15 years later. And you just go like, oh, Gore was there before they were, to sort of kind of tying it back to that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember reading Gore Vidal's critiques of Reagan when I was like 17 and it blowing my mind what he caught and what he didn't cut. I mean, to be fair, the other person who caught it is an equally problematic character, J.G. Ballard, who in no world is a left winger, but also is in no world is a right winger. He's very strange, actually, to try to. He seems to be of that period that kind of produced Vidal that turns against empire. In his case, he turns against the British Empire. Doesn't trust leftists because what he's seen happen with them in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And he sees them as like actually ending up protecting the empire in some ways. But it's very much on the cultural pulse of where particularly the United States is going, which is interesting because he's not from here. But those two figures actually in my early teens, they were very influential to me. And I read Perpetual War for Perpetual Peace, which is a great book. But the interesting thing about that book, all right, one is it mounts a defense of Timothy McVeigh that kind of leaves out his white nationalism. Although,
yes,
not to be fair to McVeigh, but McVeigh's one of these people where, yes, he had the Turner diaries on him, but his actual relationship to Nazis is a little bit more opaque.
Yeah.
And he was also a sincere anti-imperialist. And this is sometimes when I word people like I think to be a good leftist in America, you have to be an anti-imperialist. But being an anti-imperialist is in America in specific does not make you a good leftist. If you look at who the Anti-Imperial League has been, it's always been a weird coalition going back to like the 19th century of right wingers and left wingers in the United States, which is different than Europe, where like most of the right wingers are pro-imperial. And so Perpetual War for Perpetual Peace is like a very fascinating critique of the Clinton and Bush administration, I think from the left, but also mounts a pretty passionate defense of Timothy McVeigh.
Yeah.
Which is a very strange book.
It's a very strange, and those articles were ones that came out of his articles for Vanity Fair. Yeah, I think that's true. And I think that maybe the most charitable read of it is not so much like a defense of McVeigh, so much as it is an explanation and not rationalization, but just providing the public with a real, I think, maybe the most romantic read of it, in the sense that, because Gore Vidal's core argument about Timothy McVeigh is that not so much the white nationalist stuff, it's not so much the Turner Dinery stuff, which is there and it's important and it should not be denied. But what he's talking about more than that is more so that McVeigh was extremely alarmed by Ruby Ridge and Waco, and seeing, and again, that's a complicated history too, right? Because because the Branch Davidians were people who, it was absolutely a cult, where David Koresh was isolating people from their families, where they had a huge cache of weapons. Like, it's not clear cut, but you can certainly say that the United States overplayed its hand in that situation, which led to the deaths of, I think, 83 people, including children. And so you see that, you know, when the United States exports its violence around the world in the form of empire, it doesn't take very long for that violence to come back. And that's why, like, when people like, while I understand people's impulses about gun control, and I get that, like, I just don't think that that will always solve every problem with mass shootings in America, because
No,
I
I don't think
think
so either.
because it really gets to the heart of the United States is, in my opinion, the most violent society on earth. We have more military bases all over the world. We bomb more countries than almost anybody else. We kill our own people more than almost any industrialized country. And or at least if it's not the most violent, it's certainly one of the most violent. And that the empire has consequences, not just for what happens abroad, which, you know, sometimes most Americans who are not politicized don't really care about, right? Or they care about in some sort of mild moral impulse. But at the end of the day, like, that violence comes home. And the way that it comes home is Oklahoma City. The way it comes home is 9/11. The way it comes home is the mass shootings that we've seen in my lifetime go up precipitously. It's the violence that you constantly see in our country. That's, I think, the stuff that Vidal's trying to get at in those essays on McVeigh, and I think in the most charitable read. But I absolutely agree with you that it's important not to make a hero out of McVeigh, like sometimes how people make a hero out of the Unabomber, which I find very odd too.
Yeah, left wingers celebrating the Unabomber, even left wing anarcho primitivists. I'm like,
Yes.
have you read everything he's written?
Yes,
like
exactly. This is it's eco-fascism is what
Right.
he's advocating for. And so yeah, but that's part of the broader problem of the left, where it's that you know, maybe I'm more old school in this regard, but like, I'm very much on the left of the idea of a politics of hope and progress. That's what the politics of the left are for me. That today can be better, that tomorrow can be better than today, that we can actually build a better future for ourselves collectively. That, you know, not everything about industrialization is bad. It's just that when you have it in the pursuit merely of profit, not in fulfilling human needs, that's when it can kind of go off the rails. You know, that sense of hope and optimism is something that the left doesn't often have. And I think it's part of the reason that it limits itself politically, because you know, people don't really want to hear a doom and gloom message all the time. And that's not to say people don't need to be realistic. I think you do need to be realistic. But I do genuinely believe you need to have a politics of hope, you know, not optimism. You know, you have to have hope without optimism, as you know, as Terry Eagleton calls it. You know, not.
I feel like
but,
you're preempting my response. No, no. As a person who thinks that, like, part of my pessimism is actually about hope, because one of the things that I want to clear away is these false notions. My warning about Vidal is not a critique of Vidal. It's actually, I think it's something interesting about the impulse that we have in the United States, and maybe in settler countries in general. I might also extend this to Latin America and Canada, actually. But in the United States, it's a hegemon of that world in particular. Even in a multipolar world, you still got to, like, focus on us, unfortunately or fortunately. What I would say is that you see the impulse that brings you to both Marx and Pat Buchanan can actually legitimately and seriously start in the same impulse. When I, like, my realization about who Pat Buchanan was when I realized that he pulled the John Dewey and wanted to, like, he thought us entering World War I was defensible, but not World War II. And I was like, what? Like that? Like,
yeah.
I mean, like, look, I don't think we went into World War II for good reasons. Don't get me wrong, but I mean, there's a reason why that's the U.S. war everyone fucking focuses on. It's because it's the one where, like, we're clearly on the good side, even if we are also going to be quiet about the fact we're on the same side as the USSR, and China, and
it's one of the few wars we actually won.
Yeah, that too. Particularly in the 20th century. I mean, I think the American wars that we don't talk about are actually really instructive. The War of 1812,
Yep.
the which every now and then when Canadian liberal royalists get on my nerves, I say we should finish. But
Yeah.
we, as long as Canada exists, the Monroe Doctrine is not. No. But the one that I am actually most fascinated with the problematic of is the Mexican-American War, which I think is so completely like erased from
Yeah.
like it's a footnote in my history class in high school. Like we
It's so, and what's
talked about it for
crazy
30
about it
seconds.
too with the Mexican War is that very much like how all of the principles of World War II
Mhm,
sort of cut their teeth in World War One,
mhm,
all of the principles of the Civil War also cut their teeth in the Mexican War. You know, Grant, Sherman, you know, Lee, Jefferson Davis, Lincoln, like all of them, right? Lincoln gives that passionate speech where he says, "Show me the spot, you know, where we were attacked," right? And he's like, and you know, and what's interesting is that the young Lincoln would often be at odds with the old Lincoln, the Lincoln in the White House, because the same arguments that Lincoln is saying on the floor as a member of Congress, as a junior member of Congress, are kind of arguments that you could use against him as president, right? In terms of usurping of presidential power. But yeah, the Mexican-American War is so important because it is one of the most baldly imperialistic wars. And it's one that the public largely supported. I mean, Lincoln lost his reelection to Congress largely as a result of the fact that he gave this speech. And his constituents in Illinois were actually very much in favor of taking over the Mexican territories. So you have this weird interplay where a lot of the key figures who would be there a decade and a half later fighting the Civil War were there in the Mexican-American War, and often, you know, either on the right side of history or the wrong side of history, depending on where they were. But I think Lincoln's case is certainly instructive.
yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, there's also my favorite weird story about the Mexican American War is how racism and anti-imperialism of one dude, uh, an ambassador from Polk, actually ends up with us not taking all the way down to Mexico City. Um, it's because he felt bad for what he saw, but then he went back and appealed to it. Like from what I could tell from his diaries, this ambassador was like, "Well, how am I going to get people to not continue to pursue this? Let's talk about how the unwashed brown people, there are more of them once you go past Texas."
Yes.
like,
Yep.
um,
Yep.
it's just, you know, that's my vulgarization of it. But
Sure.
what's funny about that is I actually learned that late in life when I was living in Mexico. Like I was not taught that
Mhm.
anywhere in the US. I found it in some books weirdly on Texas history, but it was something I was like, man, we really need to understand that. We really need to understand the Mexican Revolution. I mean, like, you want to talk about something weird that's quiet in America. Like, there is a revolution in 1914, also, like, right next door
Yeah.
that we know almost nothing about. Like,
Yes, that we had, and we had at the time a president, Woodrow Wilson, who used the strong arm of the military to, in some respects, very much repress it. So it's like, yeah, people don't realize it's like, oh, we sort of pseudo invaded Mexico right before
oh,
World
no,
War
yeah,
One.
we invaded
Yeah,
Puebla.
yeah,
Like
yeah,
we invaded, like we invaded Puebla in the Mexican Revolution. Like, and
yeah,
you, funnily enough, I learned that from a Warren Zevon song that tells you how fucked up our history books are. But
yeah.
but I was like, wait,
Yeah. I mean, the other conflict I think it's important and instructive is also the Spanish American War too.
oh yeah, that's a huge one.
Because, you know, as somebody who studies the late 19th century, that's my specialty. You think about how the sheer brutality of that conflict. You know, whether you think of the reports of the Philippines, you know, these congressional hearings that they have on the Philippines about the war crimes that are committed by the Americans. The Philippines essentially for the next 50 years becomes a colony of the United States.
Yeah.
And its last colonial overlord, its last sort of protectorate was Paul V. McNutt, who was the former governor of Indiana. So that's how I kind of know more of this story, because Paul V. McNutt's a very, very interesting political character. He was sort of FDR before FDR. He takes office as governor of Indiana in January of 1933, and he pushes forward all these slew of reforms and very progressive reforms. And then FDR knows that, like, oh my God, this guy has all of my politics, is very popular, and he's extremely handsome. They used to say with McNutt that he had the FDR politics and the Warren Harding good looks, because he had this big white shock of hair. And so FDR's like, well, what am I going to do with this guy? I know what I'll do, because at the time, Indiana governors were term limited. They could only be in office for 4 years. So in 1937, FDR is like, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to send you halfway across the world and make you high commissioner to the Philippines. And that's exactly what he does. Basically gets rid of one of his political rivals. He's like, I'm going to pawn you off on this other side of the world. And so that you don't become a serious challenge to me in 1940. But anyway, yeah, I mean, I think the Philippines is a very instructive example. Obviously, Cuba is a very instructive example too. And the fact that the Spanish-American War is also very much shaped by the media, right? We think about the Hearst papers, right? The yellow journalism of the period. Remember the Maine, all that kind of stuff, right? So it's a war that's built by the media for the media's purposes, right? So when people say like, oh wow, all that stuff like during Desert Storm, when they had it on CNN 24 hours a day, I'm like, guys, they were doing this 100 years before that with the Spanish-American War. It was just, instead of being 24-hour television coverage, it was 12-hour newspaper coverage in the dailies and the evening papers. So the Spanish-American War is, I think, very instructive too.
Yeah, that's actually an important thing. If you want to understand how we get to World War One, I mean, there's the Franco-Prussian War and all that stuff in Europe, which is important. I'm not downplaying that.
Yep.
But like modern warfare is kind of invented between the Franco-Prussian War and the American Civil War, and then the modern media response to warfare really becomes clear in the Spanish-American War, and it's also interesting how that's taught. I will say, to defend my high school English history teacher, not English teacher, excuse me, I did learn about the papers. What I did not learn about was how thorough the Philippine suppressions were and how long they went on.
Yep. I didn't learn that till college myself. Yeah.
Yeah. It was one of those things where I was like, we did what? Like, and they still talk to us?
Yeah.
Like,
it's pretty wild when you think about it.
Yeah. I mean, it's one of those things, as I always think about it when I think about Vietnam, because one of the things I'll tell you, when I lived in the Republic of Korea, I visited Vietnam, and I was amazed at how little they hated us. But then I thought about it for a while, and I was like, well, when you win, you kind of don't need to be resentful, I guess.
Yeah, no one likes a sore winner. No one likes a sore winner. Yeah,
right, yeah,
yeah.
So
no, that's a really good point.
But yeah. If anyone ever wants a disturbing history lesson about your own history as an American, and you're ever in Mexico City, go to Chapultepec, where there's a shrine to the 8 soldiers who died defending the Mexican flag, who like jumped off the mountain of Chapultepec. Okay, that in and of itself, jingoistic story, whatever. What I'm not here to promote Mexican nationalism either, but when you realize, however, why it happened, it's like, oh, we were being assholes in Mexico City and like just decimating a training facility to put our flag up there, and we basically chased 8 not very well armed teenage military recruits off of a cliff. It's a realization. Let's put it that way.
It certainly is, and that's what gets to the heart of like the thing that I kind of grapple with a lot as an American historian who studies America, and America is my subject. Is there a version of the United States that is possible that would be consistent with my own politics? That's really like and I don't know a good answer to that. Like I have some days where I'm like, no, No, they have to start from scratch. You know, they have to do the Jefferson thing. They have to do it every 20 years, just tear it up and start over. But there's a part of me that's also like, well, there's a huge disconnect between my conception of the republic and my conception of the empire. My conception of the republic is the public, a society which does strive towards improving people's lives, that does strive, you know, the better impulses of us as a country, right? And you know, that's why, like, one of my favorite historical figures, thinking of Vietnam, is Lyndon Johnson, because Lyndon Johnson is a great embodiment of like the republic and the empire all rolled up into one. Because, you know, he was this, you know, Texas politician, New Dealer, who more than anything really just wanted to like give poor people health care and like and build schools and stuff. Now, mind you, some of that was self-serving. He wanted to be remembered by history. So you have all of this like great society, which in a lot of ways helped that improve the lives of many millions of Americans. All of us, to a certain or greater or lesser degree, have been benefited by a lot of the work done by the Great Society.
In fact, I would say a lot of what we attribute to the New Deal is actually the Great Society. But
yes, that's right. And the thing is that the Great Society could and should have been the fulfillment of the New Deal. But why didn't it happen? It happened because of Vietnam.
Right.
And that's the empire. The empire, and at the end of the day, in that sort of tortured web of mid-20th century American liberalism that sort of thought it could do it all and have it all, it was sort of destroyed by its own ambitions. And that's H.W. Brands, is a great historian from Texas. There's a great book on this called The Strange Death of American Liberalism, where he lays a lot of this out. He sort of argues that the Vietnam War was sort of a schism in liberalism that the liberalism has really never recovered from yet. And I would argue, I think he's right. And because if you think of it, had Lyndon Johnson basically said, you know what, we're not doing Vietnam. Like, why am I caring about this pissant country halfway across the world? I'm not doing anything with this, you know, as he would say it in his sort of Texas Hill Country, you know, vernacular. He would probably be beloved today. Like, people would love him. Like, he would be considered not just like one of the greatest presidents, but maybe the greatest one, you know, in the sense of the domestic achievements, the Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, Medicare, Medicaid, you know, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the National Endowment for the Arts, the Secondary Education Act, immigration reform. Like, if you look at all of that he did and that era and how successful he was, and that it was all undermined by a land war in Asia. And I think that that's a really instructive lesson for us, which is that, you know, we cannot cede to the empire. We must fight for some version of the republic, whatever that might be.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, you know, this is as my last thought, this is why I always get a little bit worried when we start viewing our, I'm not an anti-electoralist, I want people to know that, but why when we start putting our hope too much in politicians who are structurally unable to or refuse to, in certain cases, really oppose the empire. Alexander Ocasio-Cortez, and that will undermine your legacy.
Yes.
And you're absolutely right. I mean, to me, the two most interesting presidents of the 20th century, and the three presidents I hate the least, which is of the 20th century, because I hate most of them.
Yes.
Eisenhower, I'm mixed on. I hate him, but I also think he's also weirdly the most honest, which is a very bizarre.
Yeah. He's certainly the most honest about American militarism, and part of that just comes from him being a actual veteran, you know, instead of like, you know, just like a sort of snap crackle, like sort of crackerjack politician like Truman or Johnson. Yeah.
I really hate Truman. I mean,
I'll
give him credit for opposing Taft-Hartley, but then he's the first president to immediately use it.
He has very, very few wins. It's the veto of Taft-Hartley, desegregating the armed forces, and advocating for a national health care plan in 1948. Like, those are the three things. Other than that, like, I think Truman was an absolute disaster.
Like, he forces us to recognize Israel, which causes a problem. Like, we just go, if he hadn't done that, we would have actually had a moral victory, one moral victory on the USSR. Anyway, my point though on the presidents is Nixon and Lyndon Johnson are two figures of two sides of this old liberalism.
Yes.
That also get tied into, like, because I'm not a purely economic determinist. You can't accuse me of being totally economistic, but I do think it is interesting that they run out of steam on the heels of the post-war boom faltering.
Yes.
But it also causes it isn't the economy that undoes Johnson, it's the war, and then it's the economy kind of that puts Nixon in a situation where he starts acting irrationally. This is my theory on what, because he doesn't know how to handle what's going on economically, and he's already effective. I mean, he not only won in a landslide. I mean, like, if Watergate had not happened, he would have probably won.
For sure. Like people, I mean, like, guys, like, if you want to know any sense of just how crazy that whole election cycle, the Nixon reelect was, like, one, just read Nixonland by Rick Perlstein. Excellent book on that. But if you want to read like more of a contemporaneous account that's like super fun to read, it's Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail 72 by Hunter S. Thompson.
Yeah, that book is great.
That book is excellent. Like, him like basically flat out making up this story about Ed Muskie like taking like drugs on a train is like amazing. But anyway, like, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think that Nixon easily would have won re-election in 1972. I mean, it was one of the biggest blowouts in American history, precisely because the Democrats were in such bad shape on the national level, right? Because of the war, right? You have these clear divisions in the Democratic Party over the war. You have, sort of the hard hat Republicans, these sort of working class, some are pro-union people who go for Nixon because they see him as more connected to their interests, i.e., they're not really thrilled with busing, or they're not particularly thrilled with integration. So there's part of that. And then also, if you just look at the 72 campaign in general, it was a complete mess. I mean, that was when they instituted more reforms, so they tried to make it more democratic. But obviously, the VP pick was a huge mess. I mean, like, so McGovern picks Eagleton. Turns out that Eagleton had received electroshock therapy. People lost their minds over that because people weren't as in touch with that kind of stuff as, say, we would be today. And so Eagleton's off the ticket, and then eventually it's Sergeant Shriver, and it's like a whole thing. I really feel like the beginning of the Democratic Party's like descent into absolute crapdom starts with the 72 election. It's when it starts to abandon its working class impulses, ostensibly as best as it could as a bourgeois capitalist party. But like, it starts to sort of let go of its more working class impulses and starts to side with like the trial lawyers and the sort of the activist sets and that kind of thing.
This is an interesting thing to think about, because I agree with you. And what makes that interesting is, like, most people view 72 and the McGovern campaign, even some leftists read Harrington. Also, so people go back and read what Christopher Lasch said about Michael Harrington in 1968. Yes. Does it still feel relevant? And it shouldn't.
Yeah, it's true.
I was both reading that and then Hal Draper talking about the 68 election and the problems of later evilism, and both of them just made me feel like, fuck, man, nothing has changed in like longer than I've been alive, and I'm not young anymore.
Yeah, it's very, very weird. It's very weird. Like, it's there's like, especially for me as a historian, like, for me, that's why it always drives me nuts when I hear like newscasters or your sort of clickbait, will they go like, well, this is completely unprecedented in our history, and it's like, no, it's not. Like, one of the things at the Indiana Historical Bureau that we do, it's very important when we work on any kind of historical project, because we do our historical marker program. You come to our state, you see these blue and gold signs that tell you a little bit about history. We run that program. One of the things that we avoid on those is superlatives. So like first, last, greatest, best. We avoid all of those, because if you say someone so and was the first of this, you can almost always find an historical antecedent to them. And so I always drives me crazy when people are like, oh, that was unprecedented, or like never happened in our history. Drives me crazy. The one that drives me nuts is when people say we've never been so divided. And I'm like, Do the 1860s mean nothing to you? Like, do the 1960s mean nothing to
the
you?
1960s, the 1970s.
Like, what?
Fuck, man, the even the 1990s. I'm like, do you guys not remember the streak of right-wing terrorism that happened after Ruby Ridge?
Yes. Yes.
Like I lived through it. Like, I definitely remember it. And
Yeah.
and I remember talking to people older than me about this, and I'm like, what magic power does CNN have over you that you have just forgotten living memory? Like,
Yeah. I mean, I really blame it on cable news. It's a form of brain rot. Like, you're more informed by nothing than you are by watching cable news. And the problem with cable news and sort of that whole cycle is that it's a perpetual now. There is no future, there is no past, it's only now. And the other issue is that, especially I think in the last 50 years or so, especially, or even 60 years, especially with the advent of television, is that we have a politics in America that's not really politics, where it's a lot of anti-politics, where we sort of talk horse race stuff, or like, oh, this polls well, like the Steve Kornacki guy on MSNBC. He's like, all right, well, these are the suburban moms that voted for Trump in the South Carolina primary this year, and here's their educational status, like this kind of stuff. And like, well, this is all bullshit. Like, what are we doing here? And so we have a political theater which is so devoid of any actual issues or devoid of any actual history. So, so when Joe Biden goes out there and says, like, we're fighting for the soul of America, and I'm like, well, we need to define what the hell that means, for one, and two, did America ever have one to begin with? Like, what is like? It's a lot of pablum and rhetoric that is not really backed by anything, and so because of that, I think it gets people into a space where they just don't remember even things that happened in their own lifetimes. They don't even remember.
Yeah, it is a weird space. That leads me to my for real last question.
Okay.
You operate as well as on the podcast scenario on the YouTubes like me. I do not venture into Instagram, TikTok, because I can't actually say anything in less than an hour. So that may be a moral failing on my part, but you do. And one of the things I wanted to ask you about TikTok space and Instagram space, because I have found, even in 2-minute chunks, some of the best stuff on history on TikTok space, but I've also found the worst stuff I have ever seen in my life in TikTok, Instagram space. And what's weird about it is I have very little control over it. Which is not true on YouTube. It's kind of bad on YouTube because I don't see it. But one of the weird things about TikTok space is, while yes, it has an algorithm tunnel, every now and then, even if you're not in that, you'll get weird shit from another tunnel that you don't normally encounter. And I'm like, oh, someone doesn't believe Mars is real. Or it is sort of horrifying, because like I thought Facebook was bad at proving to me you can't say no one's too stupid to believe that, but like TikTok has really made it very clear to me that like there are some people doing much better public education on history, science, history, religion, and stuff than I remember existing at all in the 1990s period. I mean, I think people forget that, like, in the heyday of media control, it was still really shitty. It's just that the conspiracy theories weren't obviously political. Like, how many ancient alien and people make fun of the History Channel for that now, but like even go back to the Discovery Channel in the 90s, you've gotten people like doing ancient alien shit with the pyramid.
Yeah.
Like,
some of that goes even all the way back to the 1970s. There was, I think, a show that Leonard Nimoy hosted in the 70s called The Unexplained. It was sort of the same thing.
It was bad. I used to watch reruns of it on A&E, and like as a kid, I was fascinated with it. Now I'm like, oh my god,
it's terrible.
Like,
yeah, pretty bad.
It's like, Leonard Nimoy, I had faith in you.
I know, right? Not particularly logical, sir.
Are those weird Time Life conspiracy books? I think you may have to remember those too from like the 80s. But so I don't want to idealize. I think there's this tendency now, because of the perpetual now, I'd be like, oh, like we've never lived in an era of more misinformation. If we went back to the old gatekeepers, we would have less of it. I'm like, well, we would have some of the weirdest shit would not happen. I would agree with you, but like, I don't think you remember cable like in the 80s and 90s. Conversely, though, it does seem like TikTok and Instagram is a weird idea war space that also you don't have a lot of control over. So I want to ask you, as a left advocating historian, who, you know, one of the reasons I follow you is you do little clips on stuff like this and little reviews and all this. How do you find interacting in that space?
So that's a great question. So for me, the best way that I do it, and it's taken me a long time to get to where I'm at with it and have a healthy relationship with it, because sometimes you can get into sort of Twitter battles or TikTok comment wars or things like that. But for me, really, my goal is to be myself and to be as authentic as I can. And at the same time, you know, engage in things that I think are in good faith and just try not to engage in things that aren't. So, you know, I've posted things where people have left, you know, terrible comments, where I don't really follow up on it. I may even delete the comment if it's like, you know, borderlines and cyberbullying. And then other stuff where they make a point in my comments and I go, that's great. Because that means you're going deeper than the clip or the post that I made, you know, because basically an Instagram caption is 2,200 characters that include spaces. Mm-hmm. So anytime I'm writing anything for Instagram, I'm keeping that in my mind of like, try to economize as much as possible, which, you know, as you can see, I can talk a lot too. So, so it's about finding ways to create content that is authentic to yourself, that tries to be informative, that tries to pull the best out of the comments that you get. And for the bad comments, you just sort of, you either, if they really are just like gross or they say something nasty about you or whatever, you just delete them and move on, or you try to address them as best as you can. And so that's the best I do. You know, for me, it's about having a certain level of separation from it. I think some people live on social media all day long, and I don't. And so part of it's for my own mental health and my own sense of like being able to complete work and actually like read things and get things done. But it's also just that, you know, I always see my social media as an entry point to learning about a topic. So if I make a minute-long video about a book on FDR, or I make a, you know, 2,200 character Instagram post about a, you know, Vietnam veteran's memoir, which I did recently, you know, it's a beginning of a conversation. It's not the end. And so my hope is that people will engage with it a little bit, and learn a little bit from something, and hopefully that encourages them to go, wow, that's really interesting. I'm going to go learn more now. Because that's the way I look at it. I don't see it as the be all end all. I see it as the beginning of a conversation about history.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to approach it. Justin, I'd like to thank you for coming on the show. This has been a wide-ranging conversation. Hopefully our listeners get something out of it. But since you write and post about this stuff more, let's say, limitedly, where can people find your work? And note that I'm going to post all the links in the show notes for people to find your work too. So, but let's just go ahead and plug on that.
Great. Thank you. Well, thank you so much for having me on, Derek. This has been such a pleasure. I've had so much fun. I feel like we've had a really interesting, wide-ranging conversation on all the topics that I love to talk about. So it's really, really fun. So thank you so much for the opportunity to come on your show and have this great conversation. So people can find me at justinclark.org. That's my website. You can find all of my writing. You can find what I do in my regular day job with the state library. And you can find all the episodes of my podcast, Read Reviews, which I do with Corey Johnston. And if you want to check out more of those episodes, you can look at them on my website, or you can also follow us at The Skeptical Leftist on YouTube. You can also find me on Instagram and Threads and TikTok. I'm also on Blue Sky, although I don't really post there much very often, at Justin Clark PH. PH stands for Public History. So you can give me a follow there. And then, I regularly write for the Truth Seeker magazine, which is the oldest free thought publication in America. I'm currently working on an article, a sort of retrospective on Stephen Jay Gould and his idea of non-overlapping magisteria, sort of the debate about religion and science. His book, Rocks of Ages, turns 25 this year, so I'm kind of doing a review of that for what will be the spring issue, the May issue of the Truth Seeker. So that's where you guys can find my work.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And people
Thank
should check
you.
that out.